How did a small kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula rise to control over 5 million square miles, spanning the Americas, Asia, and beyond, becoming the world's first superpower? From the union of Isabella and Ferdinand to Columbus's discovery of the New World, the conquest of vast empires, and the eventual collapse of Spanish dominance. This is the extraordinary story of Spain's rise, glory, and fall. Let's uncover this epic tale. In the second half of the 15th century, Spain officially did not exist. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula consisted of several Christian kingdoms. The most important of them were the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon. During the previous 7 centuries, both gradually recovered the territory lost by the Moors. Muslim invaders came from North Africa and conquered a large part of Iberia at the beginning of the 8th century. In 1469, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon married in 1469 to unite their two kingdoms in a dynastic alliance and strengthen Christian power in the region. Kingdoms united. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand completed the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula for Christendom, overthrowing the last remaining Muslim group, the Emirate of Granada. Now having secured their internal borders, the Catholic rulers were able to expand their empire and raise funds for the nascent international trade routes that developed to richer and more exotic locations abroad. Spain's neighbor Portugal had already adopted this approach at the beginning of the 1420s. They explored much of the Atlantic and the African coast in search of a faster and cheaper sea route to the spice-producing East Indies, which they hoped would allow them to oust the expensive Venetians and Ottomans who dominated the trade into Europe from the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Against this background, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, or as we know Christopher Columbus, arrived at the end of the 1480s with a proposal to find an alternative sea route to Asia. Being an already well-experienced navigator, Columbus championed a new idea, which was that instead of sailing south and around Africa, one could reach Asia by sailing westward into the Atlantic and circumnavigating the Earth, believing that there would be a vast, uninterrupted sea stretching from Europe to the East Indies. At first, in the early 1480s, he asked King John II of Portugal to finance such an expedition, but his requests did not bring much success. News of Columbus' proposal soon reached the courts of Isabella and Ferdinand, who wanted to copy the commercial success of their Portuguese neighbors and establish their overseas trade routes for Spain. They agreed to support the project, and after years of prayer and careful planning, Columbus finally set sail on August 3, 1492, with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a journey of more than 2 months, the ships landed on the morning of October 12 on the island that Columbus later named San Salvador. Believing that he had reached the eastern islands, he later also called the native people of that island Indians. They continued their explorations, mapping much of the Bahamas, northern Cuba, and Hispaniola, before returning to Spain in January 1493 with news that Europeans had yet to discover the lands. In Europe, Isabella and Ferdinand were more than thrilled with the discoveries and quickly sent Columbus back on another voyage consisting of 17 ships. He later mapped a large part of the rest of the Caribbean. During a third trip between 1498 and 1500, he made first contact with the South American continent. Columbus realized that he had accidentally discovered a completely unknown continent. When he died in 1506, perhaps somewhat disappointed that he had not found his intended western sea route to Asia, he nevertheless set in motion a series of events that changed world history. After Columbus's discovery, a major problem soon arose between Spain and Portugal as to who would ultimately have control and influence over these new lands. The Treaty of Tordesillas was negotiated between the two countries, with Pope Alexander VI acting as mediator and intermediary. Signed on June 7, 1494, it divided the world outside Europe into 2 spheres of influence, one for Spain and one for Portugal. At that time, it was thought to give all of America to Spain, although later it turned out that Brazil was part of Portuguese territory. And while the Treaty of Tordesillas was being negotiated, the establishment of permanent Spanish settlements in the New World began. The first was the city of Santo Domingo, founded by the brother of Christopher Bartholomew Columbus on the island of Hispaniola in what is now the Dominican Republic in 1496. From there, a wide range of Spanish settlements were established across the Caribbean in the 1500s and 1510. Cuba became the center of the emerging Spanish Empire in 1515 after the conquest of the island and the founding of Havana. At the same time, the exploration of the American continent continued, and in 1513 the explorer Vasco Núñez crossed the Isthmus of Panama and was the first European to look at the Pacific. The development of Spain's presence in the Caribbean was only a springboard to a greater imperial aspiration. The centers of Native American civilization are located on the continent, especially in Central America, where the Mayans and Olmecs were advanced civilizations for thousands of years. When the Spanish arrived, the most prominent indigenous people was the Aztec Empire, which ruled much of what is now Mexico from its capital, Tenochtitlan, a gigantic and only accessible city built on a lake, along huge artificial roads. The Spanish first began to explore the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517, but soon heard of a rich and powerful kingdom somewhere to the west. Armed with this information, a conquistador named Hernán Cortés left Havana with a small expedition on November 18, 1518, reaching the coast of Mexico a few weeks later. In the summer of 1519, Cortés established the colony of Villa Rica de la Cruz, which became his base of operations in the Gulf of Mexico. That fall, he began moving inland, gathering allies among indigenous peoples such as the Tlaxcalans, whom the Aztecs had conquered and suppressed for decades. At the beginning of November, Cortés arrived at Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, led by their ruler, King Montezuma II, cautiously greeted the Spaniards, whom they regarded with a mixture of respect and fear, suspecting on the one hand that these men dressed in metal armor and carrying European weapons were gods, but also afraid of his true intentions. Cortés soon tried to take control of the city by arresting Montezuma and calling in reinforcements from the Caribbean. Cortés remained there in command for the next 6 months, but relations between the Spaniards and their master soon deteriorated, and on June 29, 1520, Montezuma was killed by his people while begging for peace. The following night, known in Spanish as La Noche Triste, Cortés and his men were driven out of Tenochtitlan, losing almost all of the vast wealth they had managed to amass after conquering the city. Cortés was able to regroup his small Spanish force of less than 1,000 men and many Tlaxcala allies during the fall and winter of 1520. The following spring, he began his campaign back to Tenochtitlan and laid siege to the city in early summer, when the siege began for 10 weeks. The resulting battle ended the great Aztec civilization. Many natives had already succumbed to the dangers of European diseases, such as smallpox, which the Spanish had unknowingly brought with them. The natives had almost no natural immunity to these diseases, and millions died en masse because of it. Those who somehow survived or who had not yet contracted the disease faced the wrath of the Spanish and their native allies when they arrived in the city. The Tlaxcalans were particularly determined to remove all traces of the Aztec oppressors by sacking, plundering the city, putting many of the inhabitants to the sword. Later, Tenochtitlan was soon returned to Mexico City and became the administrative capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Mexico was not the only center of advanced civilization in the Americas. Much further south and high in the Andes, people like the Chico and Nazca have established advanced societies since ancient times. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, the Inca civilization became the dominant force in the region, controlling an area consisting of a large part of present-day Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Contact with the Incas first arose in the middle of the 1520s, after which two conquistadors, Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, led men to Peru to conquer the powerful empire. Their first expedition in 1528 was not very successful, but like the Mexican Cortes, they brought smallpox to the region, which reduced the native population and weakened resistance before the imminent Spanish conquest. Pizarro returned to Peru in 1531 armed with royal approval to lead a new expedition against the Inca Empire. A protracted war broke out, lasting much of the 1530s. Unlike Cortés in Mexico, however, Pizarro did not achieve a quick victory over the Incas, partly because their empire was more fragmented than that of the Aztecs. Moreover, the Spanish were divided amongst themselves in Peru, with Pizarro and his brothers leading one faction and the Almagros leading another. This caused the outbreak of a virtual civil war between the Spanish conquistadors, although they fought against the Incas. Diego de Almagro I finally killed Pizarro himself in 1541. By that time, the Spanish had gained control of a large part of the territory, which they now controlled directly from the newly established capital of Lima. The Viceroyalty of Peru was established in 1542 against the Viceroyalty of New Spain, but the Incas continued to resist until the 1570s. The conquest of these two great original civilizations and the foundation of the Viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru formed the cornerstones of the Spanish Empire in the New World in the 16th century. But there were other developments. In the late 1530s, Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto began a series of explorations along the northern border of New Spain. These saw him map much of what is now the southern United States from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas west through Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Here too there were advanced civilizations, mountain-building cultures that lived in such remarkable cities as Etoa and Cahokia. Although de Soto was able to bring information about these areas, the Spanish did not make a concerted effort to colonize these areas for many years, except for a few initial settlements on the Florida coast and southern Texas. Simply put, better and more accessible land was closer to Mexico City and the other major parts of the Spanish Empire that were settled first. Meanwhile, Juan Diaz de Solis was the first Spanish explorer to map the mouth of the Plata Rio in the far south around present-day Argentina and Uruguay in 1516. Another explorer, Pedro de Mendoza, led an expedition there 20 years later and founded the colony of Buenos Aires on February 2, 1536. Although, like North America, a large part of Argentina and its neighboring country Chile would have remained almost untouched by Spain. In the following decades, Spanish expansion into the Americas was a gradual process and concentrated mostly in the regions of Mexico and Peru. While all this was happening in America, far across the Pacific, a Spanish colony was also established. When Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the globe from 1519 to 1522, he discovered an archipelago in East Asia that was on the Portuguese side of the borders defined in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Despite the border of Spanish territory to the west, these islands were further explored in the 1540s, when they received the name Las Islas Filipinas, or Islands of Philip, in honor of Prince Philip, heir to the throne of Spain. Only after he was crowned King Philip II in 1556 was an expedition finally sent to the Philippines in the mid-1560s to establish a Spanish colony there. Luzon Island, the northern part of the largest island of the archipelago, was quickly conquered and the city of Manila was founded in 1571. However, the Spanish faced strong resistance from the Muslim inhabitants of the southern island, Mindanao, and adjacent islets. Just like in the New World, the Spanish government in the Philippines was fragmented from the beginning, with Luzon almost completely in control. However, their settlement in the Philippines gave Spain a strategically important foothold in Asia and the East Indies. As the Spanish Empire expanded in the 15th century, it was realized that huge sums of money were needed to finance the men and necessary materials to maintain Spain's claim to these new territories. Fortunately, shortly after the Aztec and Inca conquests, large gold and silver mines were discovered in Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru. The Spanish began extensive mining of these precious metals and exploited the indigenous peoples of the area and used them as forced labor, especially at Cerro Rico near Potosi, Bolivia, a real mountain of silver discovered in 1545 that yielded 80% of world supply over the next 2 centuries. This bullion was transported overland to ports such as Cartagena in Colombia and then assembled into an annual treasure fleet that was shipped back to Spain. Spain's treasury was so massively full of gold and silver that in the second half of the 16th century it caused massive global inflation known as the Price Revolution. As more and more Spaniards arrived in the colonies, the Spanish Empire began to develop a complex society. Most of those who left Spain for the New World in the 16th century were unmarried men, often the younger sons of Spanish nobility seeking fortune in the Americas. In contrast, very few women left Spain in this way, and many Spanish men who arrived in Mexico, Peru, and other areas married natives. As a result, mixed races, or mestizos, soon began to appear in different parts of the kingdom. It was characterized by the dominance of Spanish as the spoken language and the spread of Catholicism in all aspects of colonial life. As more Europeans arrived in the Americas beginning in the late 16th century, the arrival of slaves from West Africa, especially the Caribbean, where flourishing sugar plantations required many workers, was an increasingly common sight. Despite the seemingly endless storehouses of treasures mined from the colonies, at the beginning of the 17th century the amount of gold and silver arriving in Spain had already declined. In addition, the Spanish government spent so much of this money on its wars in Europe that King Philip II had to declare bankruptcy 4 times during his reign. It was that mismanagement and the depletion of gold and silver from the New World that finally caused the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. Up to this point, the Spanish conquest and territorial expansion in the Americas largely stopped because there were no longer great civilizations like the Aztecs or Incas to subjugate. More importantly, though, the French, Dutch, and English began to occupy much of the land in North America that Spain claimed but neglected to settle properly. These 3 countries also began to threaten Spanish dominance in the Caribbean during this period as they fought over control of many islands. For example, England struggled for control of Jamaica from Spain during the Anglo-Spanish War of 1654–1660. All this showed the increasing stagnation of the Spanish Empire in the 17th century. At the beginning of the 18th century, Spanish colonial society had matured to such an extent that there were now settlements on a large area of land from northern Mexico to Chile and Argentina. Some areas remained largely unexplored, notably the arid Atacama Desert high in the Andes and the dense, diseased jungles of Guyana. They would remain largely unpopulated by Spaniards. However, 2 areas that attracted increasing interest in the second half of the 18th century were California and Texas. Since the late 1760s, the Franciscan missionary Junipero Serra and his followers explored southwestern California in particular. During the next decade, they established a dozen missionary colonies on the coast of California, which would later become the founding cities of San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. In the established centers of the Spanish colonial power, such as Mexico City, Limassol, Buenos Aires, and Santiago, a rift was divided in the meantime. Until the 18th century, almost 3 classes of people lived here. The peninsulas were administrators and newcomers to the Americas who were born in Spain. Criollos were people of Spanish descent who were born in the New World, but only to parents of Spanish descent. Finally, there were mestizos, people born in the Americas of Spanish and indigenous descent. These different groups developed different loyalties to Spain, with mainly criollos and mestizos increasingly believing that the colonies would be better off governing themselves. Although the Spanish Empire stagnated until the end of the 18th century, it still did not collapse. However, events in Europe would ultimately decide the fate of the Spanish Empire. By 1808, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte decided to take direct control of Spain and install his brother Joseph as its king. This gave rise to several rebellions in South and Central America, led by José de San Martin in Argentina, Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, Simon Bolivar in Venezuela and Colombia, and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico, among others. Between 1808 and 1810, a series of wars of independence broke out in each of these regions, where colonial nationalists tried to use the opportunity created by France from Spain as an opportunity to completely overthrow the Spanish power in South and Central America. However, they were opposed by royalist and pro-Spanish elements in all these countries, especially in the peninsula. Consequently, these wars of independence became protracted events that continued through the 1810s. After the legitimate King Ferdinand VII reclaimed the Spanish throne in 1813, Spanish aid again began to arrive in the colonies to quell rebellions. Despite this, Simon Bolivar was able to lead a successful revolution in Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama that led to the independence of Greater Colombia in 1819, which was officially ratified in 1821. He then went south to liberate. Peru, under Spanish rule, won the Battle of Ayacucho in December 1824. Then, José de San Martin and others had already established themselves. Argentina gained independence from Spain in 1816, while Chile followed suit by declaring its independence in 1818, although the war there against Spain lasted until 1826. Further north, Mexico seceded from the Spanish Empire after 11 years of intermittent war. Also in 1821, briefly establishing itself as the first Empire of Mexico, but was quickly followed by the First Republic of Mexico in 1823. The revolutions of the beginning of the 19th century almost destroyed Spain's vast overseas empire, but they kept some territories under their control, which they later jealously guarded as the last vestiges of the 19th century. National size. These included Cuba, Puerto Rico, and many other small Caribbean islands, as well as the Philippines in Asia. However, as Spain experienced increasing political instability during the 19th century, these last remaining colonies began to experience guerrilla warfare and rebellion in their quest for independence. Finally, the Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895, ushered in the final chapter of Spain's once powerful empire. The war continued there for several years, and the United States finally intervened in 1898. The ensuing Spanish-American War was a short-lived conflict in which Spain won outright and was forced to relinquish control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, all of which became more or less American dependencies. This was the end of the once gigantic and super-rich Spanish Empire, which began with the accidental discovery of a Genoese sailor after 400 years.